The planet Veltrax 9 had been caught in the grip of war for so long that entire generations were born, lived, and died without ever knowing peace. Once a thriving mining colony at the edge of the Argothi Dominion, Veltrax 9 had rebelled after decades of resource exploitation, taxation without aid, and brutal enforcement. When the initial uprising began, few thought it would last. After all, the Dominion's military was vast and technologically superior, but the rebels dug in. Literally. Veltrax-9 single quotes S crust was rich in deep tunnels, naturally formed from ancient lava tubes. The miners turned freedom fighters expanded these networks, building vast underground cities beneath the charred surface. They developed hydroponics for food, thermal drills for water, and self-contained recycling systems to survive without any external trade. The siege, meant to starve them out in a matter of months, instead became a war of attrition that stretched into a century. Above the planet, the Dominion kept a permanent blockade. Their ships hovered like vultures, preventing any supply runs, reinforcements, or evacuations. Every so often, they would bomb suspected rebel bunkers or try planetary incursions, only to be met with stubborn resistance, deadly traps, and ambushes. Even their best siege-breaker units couldn't flush the rebels out. The Dominion's pride turned to frustration. Then resignation. Veltrax-9 was declared a containment scenario, not worth full invasion, but not allowed to escape rebellion. A deadlock. Political theater. For the rebels, it became a way of life. They passed down knowledge, training, and hatred like family heirlooms. Children learned to operate drones before they learned to write. They worshipped freedom as both a religion and a curse, always close. Never one. And across the stars, the Galactic Coalition watched. A union of alien species meant to preserve balance and prevent large-scale conflict. The Coalition had long avoided the Veltrax situation. It wasn't a strategic priority. Neither side asked for help. And the world itself, covered in harsh terrain and useless beyond its now exhausted minds, held little value. The siege became a case study for war colleges. What happens when two determined forces refuse to yield? That is, until humanity joined the Coalition. At first, the other members had scoffed at the humans. They were a young species, recently spacefaring, from a world classified as Class 12 hostile, a death world. Coalition scholars expected primitive tools, disorganized politics, and weak biology. Instead, humans shocked the galaxy. They survived extremes that killed other species. They learned quickly, adapted faster, and most importantly, thought differently. Where other species built systems to avoid chaos, humans leaned into it. They had centuries of conflict, philosophy, and brute force ingenuity behind their smiles. Where others saw problems, humans saw puzzles, and their military academies? They trained for the impossible. When the Coalition offered joint training exercises to integrate human cadets into galactic peacekeeping forces, it expected them to choose simple simulations, standard pirate raids, escort missions, maybe first contact. Diplomacy. But the cadets of Crucible Unit 09, a group of Earth's elite trainees, requested the hardest simulation ever recorded in Coalition history. They wanted Veltrax-9. The instructors were baffled. The Veltrax siege wasn't a training mission, it was a legend. A long-standing political and military failure involving dug-in rebels, fanatical defense, orbital lockdowns, and no clear path to victory. It was studied, not fought, yet the humans insisted. They weren't asking to win. They just wanted to learn. The Coalition reluctantly agreed, but with strict orders. Observe only, no combat, no interference. This is a theoretical scenario, not an active war zone. That briefing took place aboard the GCS Lumen, a diplomatic cruiser orbiting Veltrax 9. In a sterile white room lit by artificial sunlight, alien instructors explained the century-long stalemate, its causes, and why it remained unresolved. But while the Chirexian commander lectured on historical nuance and Dominion logistics, Cadet Lena Voss leaned back in her chair, a small smirk forming. The others were like her, top of their class, survivors of hostile world training and trained in asymmetric warfare. They weren't interested in studying failure. The moment the humans volunteered for the Veltrax 9 siege scenario, whispers rippled across the galactic coalition. Deathworlders. A single word, loaded with meaning. To most galactic species, Deathworlders were beings born of violent, hostile planets, places where survival demanded more than intelligence. It required ruthlessness, adaptability, and audacity. Earth was one of the most infamous examples, classified as a Class 12 hostile environment due to its violent fauna, unpredictable weather systems, tectonic instability, and dangerously innovative inhabitants. Humans. So when Crucible Unit 09, composed entirely of elite human cadets, requested deployment to Veltrax 9, it wasn't bravery. It was typical Earth behavior. Run toward the most dangerous scenario in the galaxy, just to see if they could beat it. The cadets were assembled in the strategic briefing chamber aboard the GCS Lumen, a vessel orbiting Veltrax 9. Smooth alien architecture filled the room, all chrome curves and ambient lights. Holograms flickered to life, displaying the surface of the besieged planet below, blackened terrain, craters, defensive turrets, and the faint heat signatures of rebel settlements buried underground. The instructor was Commander Trell, a high-ranking Chirexian tactician with skin like stone and a voice that buzzed like low static. You are to observe the siege without direct intervention. The scenario has been in place for over a century. Your role is educational only. Cadet Lena Voss, barely into her 20s but already known for her battlefield scores and uncanny leadership instincts, raised her hand. What's the rule of engagement if we're attacked? Commander Trell hesitated. You may defend yourselves if fired upon, but your deployment is not authorized for combat operations. This is a case study. Voss exchanged a glance with her squad Reyes, the demolitions expert who once lost a finger testing an experimental grenade. Malik, the tactician, with a photographic memory. Chun, the medic who patched a lung puncture in zero gravity. And Okoye, the mobility specialist who could scale walls like gravity, was a suggestion. Understood, she said, smirking. Trell continued, unaware or perhaps in denial of what was about to unfold. You will be provided with a list of rebel strongholds, Dominion blockades, and known combat zones. Again, your orders are to observe. If captured, the Dominion has been informed that you are non-combatants. Voss leaned back in her chair and asked casually, Has anyone tried to actually solve this siege recently? Trell blinked both sets of eyelids. Solve? Cadet, this is not a test with a clear solution. It is a protracted engagement, rich in socio-political complexity. So, that's a no. The Chirexian narrowed his eyes but chose not to respond. Moments later, the cadets boarded their modified transport shuttle, a rugged, ugly Earth design with more armor than elegance and an AI navigation system that referred to itself as Dave. They were standard-issue adaptive field armor, matte black, modular, and patched with duct tape in places where official repairs were pending. As they entered low orbit, their shuttle went dark stealth systems engaged. Dominion sensors were primitive compared to modern human tech, which had been designed to hide from planetary defense grids while surfing solar flares. The dropship glided past the Dominion blockade, completely unnoticed. Inside, Reyes checked the weapon lockers. We've got impulse grenades, drone swarms, portable jammers, kinetic suppressors, and about 200 feet of industrial-grade climbing wire. That last one's my contribution. Chun prepped medkits and stacked biofoam. Injectors. Try not to get perforated. Okoye checked the terrain scanners. Dominion patrols operate in 12-minute intervals with staggered drone support. Plenty of holes in their coverage. Malik smiled without looking up. I already mapped a weak point in their orbital comms net. A timed M-burst should shut them. Up for 5 minutes. We can slip a false order to their ground squads in that window. Voss stared at the dark horizon of VEL Trax-9. She wasn't seeing an endless war. She saw patterns. Breakable lines. Solvable chaos. You know, she said to her squad, they've had 100 years to solve this. Whole academies have studied it. And they still couldn't break it, Malik added. We're not them, Voss said, locking her helmet. As the shuttle pierced the atmosphere, the cadets checked weapons, sensed comms, and ran one last systems check. Their hearts didn't race. Their fingers didn't tremble. They had trained for worse. Earth trained its Deathworlders not to survive chaos, but to master it. And somewhere on the burning horizon below, the end of a century-long siege was beginning, one footstep at a time. When Crucible Unit 09 touched down on Veltrax 9, it was not with a declaration of war, but with the silence of professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. Their stealth drop inserted them into a dead zone between Dominion outposts and Rebel sensor range, a forgotten canyon scarred by past bombardments, where seismic instability made permanent surveillance impossible. It was the perfect place for Deathworlders to vanish into the war zone. No flashy entrance. No announcement. Just boots hitting the ash-covered ground and instantly moving with military precision. Within minutes, Cadet Malik had hijacked a low-level Dominion relay node. He rerouted its signal so that the unit's movements appeared as wild fauna. Meanwhile, Okoye was scaling a communications pylon with climbing wire, planting a device that would transmit false Dominion commands at predetermined intervals. The humans weren't just here to observe. They were about to rewrite the siege. While most species fought with doctrine and formations, humans had long since embraced the art of creative destruction. They didn't aim to overpower the Dominion blockade or spark a grand revolution. That wasn't the plan. The plan was to use chaos as a tool. They would break the enemy's rhythm, exploit hesitation, and make the defenders question their own. Reality. It started small. Cadet Reyes rigged a series of Dominion power converters to emit high-pitched sonic pulses every few minutes, just outside the normal range of most species, but not the Yargathi. The result? Constant headaches, vertigo, and growing paranoia in the ranks. Guards started reporting ghost movements and phantom sounds. Chen, the medic, deployed nanodrones disguised as local insects, laced with a mild neurotoxin that caused vivid hallucinations and uncontrollable sweating, non-lethal, just enough to make sleep impossible. Morale began to unravel. Meanwhile, Voss made first contact with the rebel leadership. She walked straight into an underground rebel checkpoint alone. Unarmed, her helmet off, and calmly stated, "We're here to end your siege." The rebels nearly shot her on sight. But when she handed them the coordinates of 2 hidden Dominion ammo depots and a working schematic of a patrol schedule, they listened. Then she handed over something even more shocking. A portable coalition comms relay tuned to a frequency the rebels hadn't accessed in decades. The blockade had effectively cut off any communication with the outside galaxy. Now, for the first time in generations, the rebels had aligned to the stars. "Help us help you," Voss said. "We're not here to take over. We just hate long wars." For rebel commanders who had spent their entire lives underground, the humans were both miracle and mystery. They didn't demand allegiance. They didn't preach ideology. They simply handed over tools and strategies, then disappeared again like phantoms. By hour 6, Dominion troops were stumbling into their own traps rigged with modified rebel tech now upgraded with human ingenuity. Patrols fell into sinkholes covered with active chaff fields. Supply caravans were ambushed, not with heavy weapons, but with precision disruptor mines that left vehicles dead but passengers alive. Humiliated. Confusion spread like wildfire. Dominion commanders, used to slow and predictable rebel skirmishes, were suddenly being outmaneuvered by a ghost force using non-standard tactics. Worst of all, they couldn't find the intruders. Scanners failed. Communications were unreliable. Their own men whispered of invisible devils in black armor. The phrase, "Death World Phantoms," entered Dominion logs for the first time. Inside the Dominion base, Cadet RIAs hacked their power network and reprogrammed their lights to flicker randomly while playing short bursts of Earth music, aggressive rock riffs, and distorted opera vocals that made zero sense to alien ears. The psychological effects were immediate. An officer had a breakdown. 2 squads deserted. Commanders started issuing internal purges, suspecting spies. And all the while, Crucible Unit 09 watched and adapted. Every time the Dominion tried to restore order, the humans shifted tactics. Where they once used sound, they moved to thermal baiting, setting heat signatures of false rebel gatherings to draw Dominion airstrikes into empty canyons. When that no longer worked, they spoofed officer identities, injecting false commands into the internal hierarchy. Nothing the humans did followed a script. That was the point. They were unpredictable by design. To the rebels, they were liberation incarnate. To the Dominion, they were the embodiment of terror. And to the coalition observers, the humans were an anomaly, a reminder that war, for some species, was not just about force or strategy. It was about knowing how to break the game entirely. By the 14th hour, the siege of Veltrax 9 was no longer a siege. It was a collapse, swift, confusing, and terrifyingly precise. The Dominion's carefully maintained status quo, upheld for 100 years through brute force and bureaucratic indifference, was crumbling under the weight of 5 human cadets who refused to follow the rules of war as the galaxy understood them. The signs were everywhere. Dominion soldiers had stopped patrolling at night. Some refused to leave their barracks at all. Entire regiments locked down their own bunkers, convinced that any movement would trigger another ambush or some new psychological attack from the Death World Phantoms. Officers reported hallucinations, disrupted sleep cycles, and growing paranoia, and not without cause. Earlier that day, Cadet Malik had launched a coordinated misinformation campaign using Dominion frequencies. His messages mimicked internal command chatter, but with slightly altered orders, sending supply lines in the wrong direction and rerouting troop movements into abandoned rebel traps. When the real orders came in, no one trusted them anymore. Discipline dissolved. On the ground, rebel forces, once fractured, demoralized, and exhausted, were suddenly fighting with precision and clarity. They struck outposts in perfect coordination with timed Dominion power outages. They flooded enemy trenches with smoke and false signals, creating confusion before their attacks even began. And everywhere, Crucible Unit 09 was in the background. Invisible, guiding the momentum. Voss and her team didn't just want victory. They wanted to shatter the myth of the unbreakable siege. And to do that, they had to make the Dominion not just lose, but lose confidence. The tipping point came in the form of an amplified plasma charge, planted by Rias beneath the Dominion's main orbital uplink facility, a squat fortress that served as the planet-side brain for their space fleet coordination. With one surgical explosion, the Dominion lost their ability to communicate with their ships in orbit. Panic set in. Higher command didn't know what was happening on the surface. Field officers had no way to request reinforcements. Every decision made now was blind, rushed, and made under pressure from a collapsing command structure. Some tried to flee. They rushed to the vertical Skyrail's massive elevators designed to lift armored vehicles and personnel to orbit. But Crucible Unit 09 had already sabotaged the elevator systems, replacing their stabilizers with kinetic dampers that snapped mid-ascent. 2 troop carriers exploded mid-lift. The others grounded themselves permanently. There would be no evacuation. Meanwhile, the humans broadcast a single brief message from a captured Dominion relay station. It echoed across the rebel networks, through the Dominion frequencies, and all the way to the orbiting Coalition observers. To Dominion forces, stand down. Your siege is over. This is Crucible Unit 09. The rebels are not your enemies. We're not your enemies. But if you continue fighting, we'll become your worst nightmare. That was all. The voice calm, clipped, undeniably human, spread like wildfire. A Dominion general, Commander Ulrichs, was found in his command tent hours later, stripped of rank insignia, seated in silence, staring at a handheld screen replaying that message over and over again. I don't understand, he whispered to no one. They're just cadets. But cadets from where? From Earth. From a world where the baseline for survival included apex predators, natural disasters, and centuries of asymmetric warfare experience. From a culture that studied war not to glorify it, but to win it. At this point, the Coalition's own diplomatic observers intervened. What had begun as a passive exercise had escalated beyond any controlled environment. Now, they were watching a historical siege unravel in real time, and the architects were 5 Deathworlder students acting without full military support or oversight. There was a moment of hesitation. Should they call the humans off? Should they stop the operation before it escalated further? But the decision was made for them when the Dominion forces began surrendering en masse. It started with 1 battalion waving white thermal sheets, then another. Within an hour, entire sectors of the Dominion base had deactivated their weapons, opened comms, and requested terms from rebel leaders. For the first time in 100 years, a peaceful handover was happening, and Crucible Unit 09? They were back at their shuttle, sipping hydration packs and logging mission data. Think they'll believe we did it in under 20 hours? Chun asked, stretching. Reyes smirked. Nah, they'll think it was AI-assisted or something. Voss stood quietly, watching the rebel flags rise across the horizon. No, she said. They'll believe it. Because next time a Deathworlder cadet knocks on a simulation's door, they'll remember Veltrax 9. When the dust settled over Veltrax 9, the galactic map had changed, not in territory, but in mindset. The siege was over. And not by diplomatic negotiation, full-scale invasion, or internal collapse, but by 5 human cadets who had landed, adapted, and unraveled a century-old war in less than a day. The Galactic Coalition's orbital station, which had served as a neutral observer to the siege for decades, scrambled to make sense of what had just occurred. What was meant to be an educational deployment had evolved into a live operation with strategic consequences. Suddenly, politicians, generals, and scholars all wanted answers. How did they do it? Why did it work? And perhaps most importantly, what else were the Deathworlders capable of? The official debrief back aboard the GCS Lumen, Crucible Unit 09, was met not with celebration, but with a tight-lipped, high-level inquiry. Representatives from multiple species sat at a long, curved table in a chamber that echoed with tension. Holograms displayed battle maps, intercepted transmissions, and mission logs. You violated the parameters of a non-intervention simulation, snapped a Coalition protocol officer, a 4-eyed Delvari with a quivering crest. Cadet Lena Voss stood calmly. Her armor was scuffed, her glove still streaked with dust from Veltrax 9's surface. "No, sir," she replied. "We followed the rules. Observation only. We simply chose to observe more closely than others ever have. And the rebels? They were the ones who took action." Another officer, a bronze-scaled Sarnathi admiral, spoke up. "You coordinated rebel strikes, disrupted Dominion infrastructure, and triggered a mass surrender." "That's intervention by any metric," Voss shrugged. "They were tired of fighting. We just gave them the tools to win on their own terms." Behind her, Reyes, Malik Chen, and Okoye stood in formation. Not one of them flinched. The aftermath on Veltrax 9 on the surface. A new chapter had begun. The rebel leaders, some of them now elderly war veterans, declared the formation of a provisional planetary council. Their first act was to declare an end to all hostilities and establish open lines of communication with the coalition. Dominion forces, stunned by the speed of their defeat, withdrew under escort. No bloodshed. No final battle. Just a long overdue surrender. The humans didn't claim Veltrax as a protectorate. They didn't stay for parades or praise. They left behind only a working comms array, a declassified database of human conflict resolution strategies, and a simple message engraved into the wall of an old rebel bunker: think differently, fight smarter, end it faster. Crucible. 09, to the rebels, the humans weren't saviors, they were a spark. They had reminded Veltrax 9 that war didn't have to last forever. Galactic reaction. The ripple effects were immediate and far-reaching. Military academies across the coalition began rewriting their strategic doctrine. The siege of Veltrax 9, once studied as an example of prolonged conflict, was now referred to as the collapse, a case study in unpredictable resolution tactics. Professors were forced to include human asymmetric warfare principles in their lectures. A senior admiral from the Dominion's Naval Command was quoted as saying, "We can't fight a species that turns war into a puzzle. We play chess, they play jazz with explosives." The Dominion, humiliated and destabilized by the loss, entered a period of internal restructuring. Many of their officers resigned, citing psychological unfitness after experiencing Terran warfare. Within weeks, recruitment videos on Deathworlder colonies began boasting 5 cadets, 1 century-old siege, no casualties. Crucible Unit 09's legacy. Crucible Unit 09 returned to Earth as legends, not because they won a battle, but because they changed the definition of winning. They weren't given medals. Earth didn't celebrate military accomplishments with pageantry. But they received something far more human: respect from peers and quiet acknowledgement from the Terran Strategic Directorate. Each cadet went on to shape the future in different ways. Voss became a diplomatic strategist, advising on conflict de-escalation. Malik authored a treatise on information warfare, now standard reading in every coalition war college. Chun ran emergency medical operations in unstable colonies. Reyes became a demolitions instructor with a reputation for thinking sideways. Okoye disappeared into deep recon operations, where chaos was a job requirement, and in every corner of the galaxy, one phrase became a warning, a legend, and a promise: send the Deathworlders. It meant the problem was serious. That the situation had gone on too long. That diplomacy had failed, and that somewhere 5 young humans had once stood against a war that lasted 100 years and ended it before dinner.